One bad week can erase 11 good months. That is not an exaggeration. It happens in performance reviews every single day, in every industry, at every level of management. And most of the people it happens to never even find out why. Here's how it works. Recency bias means your brain weighs recent events far more heavily than everything that happened before them. Not because recent events are more important, just because they are fresher in your memory, easier to reach for, easier to picture in detail. Now picture an annual review. A manager sits down to score a full year of someone's work. 12 months of effort, decisions, wins, mistakes, quiet growth, nobody clapped for. But here's the trap. The manager's brain quietly overweights whatever happened in the last few weeks before that meeting, without ever announcing that it's doing it. Think about what that actually means in practice. An employee spends 11 months delivering, hits every deadline, solves problems nobody even sees, because solving them quietly is the whole point. Then in November, one project goes sideways. Maybe it's not even their fault. A vendor drops the ball, a deadline shifts, a client changes scope halfway through the build. It doesn't matter whose fault it was. That stumble is fresh. It's vivid. It's the last thing the manager remembers clearly walking into the review. So the score drops. A genuinely stellar year gets filed away as mediocre, needs improvement, or worse, did not meet expectations. Now, flip it. Someone coasts for 10 months. Minimum effort, minimum risk, nothing memorable, good, or bad. Then in December, right before review season, they deliver one flashy, high-visibility win. A big presentation to leadership. A last-minute save on a deal that looked dead, something the whole team notices and talks about in the hallway. That person walks out of their review looking like a star performer. Promotion track, top rating, a real conversation about their bonus. Neither outcome reflects the real year. One person got punished for a single rough patch, surrounded by 11 months of excellence. The other got rewarded for one good moment, surrounded by 10 months of average forgettable work. The score on paper says performance. What it actually measures is memory. Specifically, whatever memory happened to be loudest and most recent, right before the meeting started. Here's the part I find genuinely strange about this, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Managers aren't doing this on purpose. Nobody sits down and consciously thinks, I'm going to ignore 11 months of data and just go with my gut about the last 3 weeks. It happens underneath conscious thought, below the level where a manager could catch themselves doing it. That's exactly what makes recency bias so dangerous in a management context. It doesn't feel like bias from the inside. It feels like judgment. It feels like, I just remember how things have been going lately, and that's what I'm scoring. The manager isn't lying to the employee. They're not even lying to themselves. They're just measuring the wrong thing and sincerely calling it the right thing. This isn't some fringe idea that psychologists made up to sell a book. It connects to something well established in how human memory actually works. Ever notice how it's easier to recall the last few items on a list than the ones stuck in the middle? Psychologists have documented this pattern for over a century, going back to early memory research in the late 1800s, long before anyone was thinking about performance reviews at all. The most recent information you take in tends to sit closer to the surface of memory, easier to retrieve, easier to picture in specific detail. Older information doesn't disappear completely, but it gets harder to access on demand. It blurs into a vague general impression instead of a sharp, specific memory you can describe. Now stack a second, related mental shortcut on top of that first one. The easier something is to recall, the more weight your brain unconsciously assigns to it, almost as if ease of recall were proof that the thing matters more. It isn't proof of that at all. It's only proof that the event happened recently, or that it happened vividly, or both. A dramatic failure in November is easy to recall in vivid detail. 11 months of steady, unremarkable competence is not easy to recall in the same way, because steady competence rarely produces a specific, retellable story. So the failure gets treated as if it matters more to the whole year, purely because it's louder in memory, not because it's actually more representative of the work. Put those two effects together, And you get exactly the trap the annual review format walks people into. It's a format that asks a manager to summarize 12 months of work in a single number or rating using a memory system that is structurally built to overweight the last few weeks of that period. The format and the brain are working against each other from the very start, and nobody designed it that way on purpose. It's just what happens when you build a once-a-year ritual on top of a memory system that was never built for once-a-year accuracy. There's a related trap worth naming here too, because it often rides alongside recency bias in the same review. Psychologists call it the halo and horn effect. One strong or one bad moment doesn't just get overweighted in isolation. It starts coloring how the manager reinterprets everything else from the year. The December star's earlier average months suddenly get remembered as solid contributions, building toward that big finish. The November stumbler's earlier great months suddenly get remembered as maybe not as strong as I originally thought. The recent event doesn't just get its own weight, it quietly edits the story of everything that came before it. This is exactly why researchers studying performance management started flagging the once-a-year review as a structural problem, not just an occasional scheduling inconvenience that catches a few unlucky employees. The issue isn't that individual managers are careless or unfair people. The issue is that a 12-month gap between the actual work and the evaluation of that work gives recency bias an enormous amount of room to operate, unchecked, every single cycle. The longer that gap stretches, the more the final few weeks of the period get to stand in for the whole thing, quietly, without anyone flagging it as unfair. So companies started shrinking the gap on purpose. Deloitte moved toward frequent check-ins, restructuring its entire review process around more regular, shorter conversations, instead of a single annual verdict handed down once a year. Adobe did something similar, replacing its old annual review system with ongoing check-in conversations between managers and employees, some running monthly, some running quarterly, depending on the team. The logic is simple once you can see the mechanism sitting underneath it. If you evaluate someone every month, no single bad week can hijack an entire quarter, let alone an entire year. The window recency bias has to work with just gets smaller, and a smaller window means a single event has a much smaller stretch of time to unfairly represent. But here's the part nobody expects when they first hear about this shift, and it's the part that makes this more than just a two-company anecdote. This wasn't a small trend limited to Deloitte and Adobe experimenting quietly with HR culture. It was part of a much broader move away from traditional annual ranking systems across corporate America, roughly starting in the mid-2010s and picking up momentum from there. Several major employers moved away from rigid, once-a-year forced ranking review structures around that same period, restructuring toward more continuous feedback models instead. Microsoft is one widely reported example, publicly shifting away from a stack ranking system that had employees essentially competing against each other on a fixed curve every year toward more frequent developmental check-ins between managers and their teams. Accenture made a similar, widely covered move away from its traditional annual review process around the same window, citing the same basic complaint. A once-a-year snapshot doesn't capture how someone actually performed across the year, it captures how they were remembered. GE, long famous for a strict forced ranking system built under Jack Welch, moved away from that model as well, toward more frequent, informal feedback conversations. None of these companies were chasing a trend for its own sake. They were all converging on the same underlying diagnosis, independently from different industries. The common thread across every one of these changes is the same insight buried inside the recency bias problem. The further an evaluation sits in time from the actual work being evaluated, the more that evaluation reflects memory distortion instead of reality. Shrink the gap between the work and the review, and you shrink the distortion that gap allows to build up. Here's an analogy that makes the mechanism obvious. Imagine judging a marathon runner by only watching the very last mile of a 26-mile race. If they sprint that final mile with everything they have left, you'd rate them a phenomenal runner. If they stumble in that final mile, exhausted after 25 miles of genuinely strong, disciplined pace, you'd rate them a poor one. Either verdict would be completely wrong. You didn't watch the race, you watched 3 minutes at the very end and mistook those 3 minutes for the whole story. An annual review built around whatever happened in the final few weeks of the year is doing exactly that, just with somebody's job and livelihood instead of a race medal. Or think about it like restaurant reviews, which most people already have an intuitive feel for. If a reviewer visits a restaurant 12 times over the course of a year, and the food is genuinely excellent 11 of those times, but the 12th visit happens to land on a night when the kitchen is short-staffed and everything comes out wrong, a fair review accounts for the full pattern across all 12 visits. An unfair review, written the week after that one bad visit, calls the place inconsistent or even bad, simply because that last visit is what's fresh in the reviewer's head as they sit down to write. The 11 good visits are still just as true as they always were. They just aren't loud in memory anymore, so they don't get counted the way they should. You can see the same pattern outside of offices entirely, which is part of why it's worth taking seriously instead of writing off as an HR quirk. Investors famously chase whatever fund or stock performed best over the last quarter, even though a single strong quarter says almost nothing about a fund's actual skill or discipline over a longer stretch. Sports commentators famously declare a player back after one great game, ignoring a whole season of mediocre stats leading up to it. Weather forecasters know that people trust today's forecast more than yesterday's, even when yesterday's turned out to be wrong, simply because today's is the one sitting freshest in mind. None of these are separate phenomena. They're all the same underlying wiring, just showing up in a different room. Now, here's what makes this genuinely interesting from a management standpoint, and not just a quirky psychology fact to bring up at a dinner party. Recency bias doesn't just produce inaccurate scores on a form somewhere. It produces the wrong incentives across an entire team, over time. If employees learn, even subconsciously, that the weeks right before review season matter more than the rest of the year combined, they will optimize for exactly that, because that's what the system is actually rewarding. Regardless of what the official policy says, you end up with a workplace where people quietly save their best effort, their flashiest projects, their most visible wins, for the weeks leading directly into review time and coast a little harder the rest of the year. That's not a workforce being lazy or cynical. That's a workforce responding rationally to a badly designed measurement system, the same way water finds the fastest path downhill. The bias isn't just distorting scores after the fact, once a year. It's shaping behavior before the fact, all year long, because people are perceptive enough to notice what actually gets rewarded versus what leadership merely says gets rewarded. So what does a manager actually do about this? Practically, starting this week, not at some vague point in the future. The fix isn't complicated. It just isn't automatic, which is exactly why most managers never get around to doing it, even when they know about the problem intellectually. Keep a running log through the year, not a vague mental impression you'll try to reconstruct from scratch in December. An actual written record, however simple. A shared document, a basic spreadsheet, even short-dated notes jotted down right after major projects wrap up. Write down wins when they happen, while the details are still specific. Write down misses when they happen too, along with the surrounding context, not just the bare outcome stripped of everything that explains it. Do this monthly, if you can realistically manage it. Quarterly, at an absolute minimum, if monthly genuinely isn't realistic for your workload. When review time finally comes around, don't ask yourself how you feel about this person right now, today, in this room. That question is exactly the trap in disguise, because right now is already contaminated by whatever happened in the last 3 weeks, whether it was great or terrible. Instead, pull out the log you've been keeping and rate the whole period against what's actually written down in it, in black and white. Rate the pattern across the full 12 months, not the mood you happen to be in on the particular day you sit down to write the review. If you manage a team, treat this as a real process change worth protecting, not a New Year's resolution you quietly forget by February once things get busy again. Block time on your calendar right now, once a month, for a genuinely short, 15-minute note on each direct report. What went well this month? What didn't? What context matters? That a bare rating number would never capture on its own. It takes far less time than most managers assume it will, and it removes almost all of the guesswork and last-minute scrambling when review season finally arrives on the calendar. You're not trying to remember an entire year from scratch anymore, under pressure, the night before the meeting. You're just summarizing notes you already trust because you wrote them in the moment. One more practical habit worth adding: if you have any say in how your team runs review season, before you finalize any rating, physically scroll back through your log to the first entries from the year, not just the most recent ones. Force yourself to read January and February before you read November and December. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but it directly counteracts the exact mechanism causing the problem, because it deliberately pulls the earlier, faded memories back into view before you commit anything to paper. If you manage other managers, build this same expectation into how they run their own reviews too, so the fix doesn't live or die with one well-intentioned person on the team. Because here's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this. If you're not doing that, if you're relying purely on memory alone at review time, you're not actually evaluating performance, no matter how confident you feel while you're doing it. You're evaluating whatever happened to be fresh in your head on the day you sat down to write it. And the person on the other side of that review, the one who worked 11 genuinely strong months and simply had one rough week near the end, deserves a great deal better than that. Follow for more theories that actually explain your workplace